Ну, как раз все мое детство пришло, это на военные, на голодные годы, так что мы там только лишь бы пухлые ходили, жали бы выжить, какие там власти.
November 20th, 1990, Andrei Chikatilo, the cold-blooded killer of Rostov, was arrested after murdering at least 53 people. Now, decades later, disturbing footage of him has resurfaced, which has left everyone in shock.
We'll do the same thing.
Do you think you're a hero to those hate groups?
Well, that's what they tell me, you know.
July 28, 1984, Joseph Paul Franklin was arrested. After his arrest, he was in several interviews, revealing the deadly things he had done. In the 1970s, Joseph was a notorious serial killer, responsible for a string of racially motivated murders and shootings across the United States that lasted into the early 80s. During his time in custody, Franklin participated in several interviews, offering a rare opportunity to understand the psychology of a serial killer. He seemed to relish these interviews as he always turned the conversation to glorifying what he did. In these conversations, he revealed his twisted ideology and the factors that drove him to commit such heinous crimes.
Mixed-race couples and blacks, I figured if once I started doing it and showed them how, other white supremacists would do the same thing, follow suit.
One of the key themes that emerged from this was the deep-seated racism and hatred towards non-whites. He was always talking about his belief in white supremacy and his desire to spark a race war. In this deadly logic, he saw himself as a soldier in the racial holy war, targeting African Americans, Jews, and interracial couples. It was particularly chilling watching him speak about his victims with no remorse. He referred to his killings as missions and described the victims in dehumanizing terms. But that's not all. He claimed that his victims were chosen at random and that he felt no emotion as he acted, further emphasizing the cold and calculated nature of his crimes. Now, Franklin also discussed his methods and the planning that went into his crimes. He said that he would often stake out locations, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. He would use disguises and a careful selection of weapons. After his arrest and subsequent interviews, it provided an insight into the mind of a racist killer. It offered a glimpse into the motivations and thought processes of a person who can target innocent people based on the color of their skin. November 20th, 2013, Franklin was executed by lethal injection in Missouri, bringing an end to a deadly serial killer. (1990) Gainesville, 5 college students were murdered. However, this was only the beginning. The killer would later reveal the twisted pleasure he got when he went on this killing spree. September 1990. The city of Gainesville, Florida was paralyzed by fear in the summer when 5 college students were brutally murdered. Danny Harold Rowling, aka the Gainesville Ripper, was revealed to be the man behind these heinous acts, and he was immediately sentenced to death following his arrest. But during his time on death row, he got several interviews. Here he would talk about the disturbing details of his life and crimes. One time he talked about how much he liked sticking people with knives. His words were without remorse and painted a picture of a deeply disturbed individual. His confessions revealed a history of abuse at the hands of his father, which he claimed contributed to his violent tendencies. He described how he would meticulously plan his attacks by stalking his victims before striking. His intent wasn't only to kill, but to create a spectacle of fear. The interviews really gave us a deep dive into his brain. The community where Rowling lived was left in shock at the reality of the evil that had lived among them.
He told me that he was proud of what he did.
Rowling was so proud of these murders that he just couldn't hide it. October 25th, 2006. Danny Rowling was executed after a lengthy legal process. However, even after that execution, the memory of his deeds lingers, a reminder of the potential for human depravity. Even hours before he was executed, Rowling confessed to 3 more murders that was revealed in a note that he handed over to his spiritual advisor.
Go ahead and put the electric chair to me. I should have never done it, she told police.
October 9th, 2002, Aileen was injected with that lethal concoction for the heinous murders that she had committed. But the things she told the entire world before her death would send shivers down the bravest spines. In the history of American crime, few names are as notorious as that of Aileen Wuornos, the serial killer whose life and death captivated the nation. Her story is one of tragedy, controversy, and a deeply troubled soul.
This is evil, what those people have done to me.
Do you feel anger or even hatred towards men?
I never hated men.
Her final interview with British documentary filmmaker Nick Broomfield was a window into the mind of a woman who had faced a lifetime of abuse and marginalization. 1989 to 1990, Wuornos was responsible for the death of 7 men, for which she was convicted. However, she insisted on her innocence until her last breath, claiming self-defense every time and accusing the police of allowing her to kill. In a chilling statement, she openly admitted to committing the crimes, showing us no remorse. She killed those victims and stole from them without hesitation, and according to her, she would do it all over again if given the chance. Her words show deep-seated hatred and prove the sentiments she expressed throughout her trial and incarceration. Her interviews revealed a person who felt betrayed by society and the legal system. She spoke of isolation, spending time alone in her cell, and finding solace in the Bible. Her anger was obvious as she accused the media and society of exploiting her story for profit and entertainment. The narrative of her life is a complex one, marked by childhood abuse and just living on the wrong side of society. Her crimes, she claimed, were acts of survival in a world that showed her no kindness. In her 4-hour videotaped confession, she constantly repeated how she could not resist the urge to kill over and over again. As the day of her execution drew closer, Wuornos' attitude became increasingly rough, with some claiming that she had gone insane. However, the state governor of Florida ordered a psychiatric evaluation to get done, and 3 psychiatrists would affirm that she was fully aware of what she did and the consequences of her actions. After a positive evaluation, the state proceeded with her execution, ending the chapter of the woman who was known as the Damsel of Death.
Extraordinary confrontation between the killer and his only surviving victim.
July 12, 1999, on the U.S.-Mexican border in El Paso, the identity of a serial killer known as the Railroad Killer was revealed after he surrendered to the FBI. This guy was responsible for a lot of murders, and in his infamous interview, it really scared anybody who listened to him.
Given entirely in Spanish, Reséndiz doesn't necessarily go into explicit detail about the murders in this interview.
May 22, 2000, Reséndiz was sentenced to death after being convicted for at least 23 murders by a Texas court. While in jail, he granted multiple interviews, which were done in Spanish. During that time, he displayed a disturbing lack of remorse. In fact, he once said, without any emotion, that all his victims got what they deserved, and he owed them no apology. The interviews and investigations revealed a pattern of behavior that was both shocking and deeply concerning. This guy would linger around the homes of his victims, eating their food and going through their personal belongings. He would study their driver's license and take sentimental items before fleeing the scene. Now, his MO was peculiar, as it was horrifying. He would travel across the country by hopping off and on trains, a method that earned him the moniker the Railroad Killer. This method of transportation allowed him to escape the law for a long time. In his interview, he revealed that he often beats his victims to death with blunt objects he found in their homes, like rocks or a pickaxe. He would then just cover the weapons to keep it from immediate view. Now, this guy was apprehended in the U.S. after a manhunt and was deported back to Mexico. But this wouldn't stop his killing spree, as he was later listed as the 457th fugitive on the FBI's 500 Most Wanted. The Railroad Killer was able to evade capture until his sister phoned the police and offered to convince Reséndiz to turn himself in. She saw her brother's FBI Most Wanted poster and was pretty scared that her brother could kill again if left free, or he might just be killed by Mexican bounty hunters. So on June 27, 2006, Angel Reséndiz was executed by lethal injection. His crimes were as brutal as they were senseless, claiming many lives across the United States and Mexico during the 1990s.
So you've got to have faith it'll work, or else you'd be reduced to some kind of, mumbling idiot.
January 24, 1989. America's most notorious serial killer, Ted Bundy, was taken out by electrocution. However, before that execution, many journalists and doctors had interviewed and documented what he had to say. Theodore Robert Bundy was an American serial killer who kidnapped, raped, and murdered dozens of women and girls. On February 12, 1978, he was arrested for killing Kimberly Diane Leach 4 days prior. 1 year later, he was brought to trial, which was covered by 250 reporters from 5 continents. As a matter of fact, his trial was the first to be nationally televised in the U.S. February 10, 1980, Bundy received a third death sentence, and this time by electrocution. While awaiting that sentence, though, Bundy participated in a series of interviews, including those with FBI profiler Robert Ressler, journalist Stephen McCaud and Hugh Ainsworth, and psychologist Dr. James Dobson. It was these dialogues that Bundy revealed aspects of his twisted psyche and his methods of luring victims.
Certainly the most extreme punishment society has, and I think society deserves to be protected.
Now, his interviews were mixed with manipulations, deflections, and occasional truths. He would often speak in the third person when discussing his crimes, detaching himself from the brutal reality of his actions. From the interviews, it was discovered that Bundy's charm and articulate manner were tools that he would exploit to gain the trust of his victims. His law student facade and feigned injuries were tactics to lower their defenses. The interviews also shed light on his deep-seated resentment towards women, which fueled his violent impulses. Psychologists concluded that Bundy's articulate nature masked a severe personality disorder. His lack of remorse and empathy, combined with a grandiose sense of self, were indicative of psychopathy. The interviews didn't lead to a consensus on what drove Bundy to kill, but they did provide a disturbing look into the mind of a man who viewed his victims as objects to control and destroy. In that final interview with Dr. Dobson, Bundy attempted to shift blame onto pornography, claiming it corrupted him. Well, that was met with a lot of skepticism because there's a lot of people out there watching pornography and don't really become violent criminals.
Would you have hurt those people? Why did you kill those people?
No comments. No comments. I cannot answer that at this time.
June 7th, 2013. The Nightstalker, aka Richard Ramirez, died from cancer after he was sentenced to death for the murder of several people. Now, while he lingered on death row, he granted several interviews where he was describing the horrifying things he'd done. April 1984 to August 1985, Ramirez took out at least 14 people. He was an American serial killer and sex offender whose killing spree occurred in the greater LA and San Fran Bay area of the state of California. His crimes would usually take place in the late afternoon during various break-ins, leading him to being dubbed the Nightstalker and the Walk-In Killer. August 31, 1985, Ramirez was arrested in LA and was sentenced to death in California's gas chamber 3 months later. In a series of chilling interviews, Ramirez often spoke with a cold detachment about his crimes, showing a lack of remorse that both disturbed the public and authorities. In his confessions, he talked about having desires he must satisfy, else he gets crushed.
Whereas if I didn't give in to them, I would be crushed by them. I believe in the evil in human nature.
His words painted a picture of a man who had embraced his dark nature. One time he claimed that everyone was evil in their own special way. According to investigators, his words revealed that he was a man who didn't own up to his own responsibilities but tried to play the blame game. In this other interview, he claimed that the most things said about him were lies, presuming innocence, although in the same breath he says he's evil. And he seemed to like toying around with those who interviewed him. He would say one thing one moment and contradict the next, but it all seemed to be intentional, and there was a shadow of jest in his eyes as he spoke. Now, during his incarceration, Ramirez gave rare insights into his beliefs and motivations. This guy studied Satanism and often made references to it during his trials and interviews. He had a fascination with the occult along with satanic symbols that he would leave at crime scenes, which became a horrifying signature of his murders. Now, his lack of empathy was also apparent as he described the nature of his killing. According to him, he believed that killing is killing, whether done for duty, profit, or fun. On June 7, 2013, Richard Ramirez died from chronic substance abuse and a chronic hep C viral infection before his execution.
Murder committed there in Geauga County, and I'm responsible for it, and I am wanting the death penalty.
1967, Ed Wayne Edwards was granted parole, but then he committed some other crimes that gave him the death penalty. 1997 witnessed the murders of Bill Lavaco and Judith Strobe in Ohio, and in 1980, Tim Hack and Kelly Drew were murdered in Wisconsin. The man responsible for this was Ed Wayne Edwards, a man who was on parole but went on a killing spree instead. When Ed wasn't busy killing and committing other crimes, he was granting interviews and going on TV shows. This guy was one of the most unusual serial killers ever caught. 2009 made it 35 years Ed had avoided arrest. But that year his luck ran out when his daughter, April Bellaccio, tipped the police off that she suspected her dad was involved in the murders of Tim Hack and Kelly Drew. It's also suspected that this guy really took out 15 people, but there was only evidence for 5.
Give the money to another person, and so then it ended, so I went back and picked him up.
In this exclusive jailhouse interview with Geauga County Maple Leaf news editor Glenn Miller, Edwards spoke candidly about his crimes. To him, it was a game. He even boasted about how he was always several steps ahead of law enforcement. Edward would evade capture due to his nomadic lifestyle. He had lived in at least 24 states, so his crimes really couldn't be pinned on him. He was always changing his name and had a unique ability to just blend into society. Even when he was eventually captured, his neighbors couldn't believe that he had committed the atrocities he was accused of. But the most interesting thing about Wayne was how he lived for public attention. Despite being a serial killer who wasn't trying to get arrested, he sought the limelight, granting interviews and appearing on TV shows. The craving for recognition came from his ego, and perhaps a deep-seated need to be acknowledged, which he expressed through his autobiography and public appearances. Ironically, his love for attention was a double-edged sword. While it helped him build a facade of reformation, it also left a trail that eventually led to his downfall when his past crimes caught up with him. On April 7, 2011, Wayne had died from natural causes at a medical center in Ohio, escaping his execution by just 4 months.
Velma Barfield was convicted and sentenced to die in 1978.
November 2, 1984, Velma became the first woman in the U.S. to be executed by lethal injection. However, she's not unlike other serial killers the world has known. 46-year-old Velma Barfield was dubbed the Death Row Granny when she gained popularity after a series of interviews and confessions that unveiled a harrowing tale of manipulation and murder. May 13, 1978, Barfield got arrested after investigations showed she was responsible for the death of her ex-husband. At first, it seemed like an isolated case, but to the shock of everyone, she had murdered her previous partners as well. The extent of her crimes and motives weren't fully understood until Velma began speaking to the press while she was on death row.
The last 10 years was just like that. Years of a drug nightmare. Days of not knowing.
Her interview showed a woman who seemed sorry for the things she did and was pretty desperate to compensate for her wrongdoings. Unlike most serial killers, her motivation seemed to be for money and not the pleasure of killing. However, when it comes to Barfield, she had been forging checks in the name of her ex-boyfriend, Rowland Taylor, and stole from his account. You see, Barfield had a drug problem and was using the money she stole from Taylor to support that addiction. When she realized that he was about to discover what she was doing, she poisoned him to death with some arsenic-based rat poison that she mixed in his tea. Her wicked acts weren't limited to just her former partners. She would kill several people she worked for as a caregiver. January 29, 1977, Mr. Montgomery Edwards, one of the elderly people she was caring for, fell ill and died. A month later, his widow Dolly would get similar symptoms, and soon she was dead too. After her arrest, Velma confessed to 6 murders, but she was only charged for that of her ex-boyfriend, Rowland Taylor. Now, before her execution, Velma became a devout Christian and helped other inmates deal with their problems by offering prayers and counseling. Her work was noticed by the state, and she almost got a pardon that would have changed her death sentence to a life sentence, but her fate was sealed. January 3, 2014, the chapter of notorious serial killer Tommy Lynn was closed when the state of Texas executed him using that lethal injection. Now, before he was brought to justice, this guy had taken out 22 people. December 31st, 1999. Tommy Lynn was arrested after attempting to murder 2 girls. Thankfully, one of the girls survived and was able to identify him. After his arrest, Lynn got a lot of attention, and he loved it. In fact, he was really eager to talk about his crimes. As far as he was concerned, the death penalty was the ultimate punishment, and it didn't really matter how much crime he confessed to later on because his sentence wasn't getting worse than that. So, he used the opportunity to make sure that he wouldn't be so easily forgotten. This guy loved to talk and brag about the evil things he did so much that people started doubting the exact number of people he killed.
No matter, blood is blood. It didn't matter man, woman, child.
No more thrilling to kill the mayor of the town than the homeless guy on the street.
No.
His interviews and investigations went on to reveal a troubled childhood, obviously filled with abuse and neglect, which Lynn often cited as the foundation for his later crimes. During interviews, Lynn provided a horrific insight into the mind of a psychopath. In this disturbing revelation with ABC News, he expressed a complete lack of remorse as he stated he was hatred itself. Additionally, he claimed to hate the idea of apologizing, which was why he never said the words love and sorry to anyone. Oh, this guy was really hard to listen to, but it really did offer a glimpse into the profound absence of empathy characteristic of such a cold-blooded killer. September 24th, 1985, Bobby Long pled guilty to 8 charges of homicide and was sentenced to death. What this guy said while awaiting execution was unexpected as it was shocking. This guy was known in the media as the classified ad rapist. That's because his MO was to look up ads, get details of women, and set up a meeting with them to rape them. In most cases, he only raped and robbed the victims, but 10 women wouldn't be so lucky as they were murdered in cold blood.
I don't have no feelings no more, no emotion, no.
During his imprisonment, he was interviewed by various professionals. What came out of these interviews was really messed up. This guy would also express a lack of remorse for his actions, stating that he wasn't sorry for the things that he had done, even if he wanted to be. Everybody was pointing towards his troubled childhood. This guy had suffered multiple head injuries from all sorts of accidents, which probably changed his personality down the road. Bobby grew up with a heart filled with hate and bitterness. As a child, because of a genetic disorder, he had large breasts. And because of this, he was mocked and bullied, leading him to breast reduction surgery in adolescence. At home now, he would feel resentment towards his mom, as she was bringing a different guy every night. And all the men that she brought over weren't too nice with Bobby here. So as far as he was concerned, these events justified his evil acts, and he was always quick to bring these up in his interviews. May 23, 2019, Bobby Joe Long was taken out by lethal injection after waiting 30 years on death row.
Talked about his life, about his punishment, and about the suffering of his victims that led him down this trail to his death.
December 3, 1985, just 3 days before his execution, Carol Cole gave an interview to KLAS-TV. Little did anyone know that this interview would go down in history as some of the most popular footage of a cold-blooded killer giving accounts of his actions. Born in Sioux City, Iowa, Cole's life was filled with early childhood trauma. His mother's emotional abuse and public humiliation, dressing him as a girl and subjecting him to ridicule, laid the groundwork for his later crimes. Cole's first known act of violence was when he drowned his classmate at just 8 years old. Now that act was initially swept away as an accident. Who could have thought that it was the beginning of a murder spree? Cole's adult life was also a series of incarcerations and releases, with multiple stints in mental institutions as well. Despite clear signs of antisocial personality disorder and violent tendencies towards women, this guy was repeatedly deemed fit for release. November 1980, Cole was arrested. His criminal record had grown so much at that time that he was responsible for the murder of at least 16 women, though he's suspected of killing up to 35 between 1947 and 1980.
They might, something might go wrong, or, be some kind of suffering.
In this haunting final interview with KLAS-TV, before that execution, Cole expressed a chilling resignation to his fate. He expressed a fear of something going wrong with his execution, which might cause him suffering that he's unprepared for. Critics, however, found that ironic for a man who killed 35 people was concerned about not being comfortable on the day of his execution. This guy would chain smoke during the interview, in this attempt to probably calm his nerves. He would show remorse for what he did, and admit that he deserved what was coming. So on December 6, 1985, Cole was executed by lethal injection at the Nevada State Prison. In 2014, Gary was on the TV series The Killer Speaks, and what he said left everybody in shock, as he described the stone-cold murderer that he was. November 22, 1994, Gary, infamously dubbed the I-95 Killer, was arrested for targeting and killing 6 men. However, as he was talking about the killings on the TV show, he left no doubt in anyone's mind that he enjoyed talking about the heinous things that he had done. I mean, you could see the sparkle in his eye, a hint of smile dancing around his lips as he eagerly talks about his mode of operation. He even brags about stealing the identity of one of his victims to evade capture. As far as Gary was concerned, his actions were justified as he claimed all his victims had done something to trigger him. He believed that killing him was the only way it would have ended, because he couldn't help himself until he hurt those who triggered him. Gary's victims, who he often met in gay bars, were lured with the premise of companionship only to meet a grim fate. The murders weren't mere acts of aggression but prolonged ordeals, as noted by prosecutor Bernie Della Rionda, who described them as brutal and a life-and-death struggle. March 1994 marked the beginning of Gary's reign of terror when he strangled his first victim, John Roberts, a man who was kind enough to offer him a place to live. Instead, Gary would beat and strangle him to death, and this was the same pattern that the I-95 Killer used to get most of his victims. On August 22, 2019, Gary was executed at the Florida State Prison.
So you were kind of in a sense of, I already got caught once, right? Now I got to think a little.
January 5th, 1993, Wesley DOD was hanged at Washington State Penitentiary. This guy was the first to get hanged in the U.S. since 1965. Now, besides that execution, what made his case truly terrifying were the things he said. November 13th, 1989. Dodd was arrested after he tried kidnapping a boy who had gone to a movie theater with his parents. Before that arrest, though, Dodd had already sexually assaulted and killed boys in the Vancouver area of Washington. During this investigation, Dodd's own words painted a horrifying picture of his actions. Also detailed in a diary found by police, he would confess to his crimes and describe his plans to kidnap, torture, and sexually abuse his victims. But that's not all. He recounted the murders he committed in detail, leaving everybody in shock. The interviews with law enforcement were equally disturbing. This guy confessed to molesting at least 175 victims over the span of 15 years. His confessions and overwhelming evidence found in the apartment led to the charges of 3 counts of first-degree murder and attempted kidnapping.
It's not hard to kill somebody. You can kill somebody pretty easy if you have the mindset for it.
Interestingly, Dodd bragged about how easy it was for him to kill, even during his trial. He pled guilty to all charges, and even requested to be put to death, stating that he would kill again if set free. This guy never doubted his capacity for evil. He seized every opportunity he was given to warn authorities never to let him out. It almost seemed like he wanted them to hurry up his execution, being on the verge of doing something eviler than he did before. Dodd remained unremorseful even till he was executed. He's rated as one of the most dangerous humans ever.
Well, I'm a serial killer. I've killed 8 women, 6 in this state and 2 in New York. I'm on death row for 4 of those women. Nothing they could have said or done. It was me, it wasn't them.
May 12th, 1981, Jung-Nak Tu, a 25-year-old student at Cornell University, was murdered. But this wouldn't be the end of the tragedy. On June 29th, 1984, Michael was arrested for murdering 7 more women who were killed similarly to Jung-Nak around the Connecticut and New York areas. However, Ross was only prosecuted for just 4 of those murders, which was enough to land him a death sentence. Further investigations revealed his troubling background. This guy was raised on a chicken farm in Connecticut, where he endured severe abuse at the hands of his mother, and possibly a dirty uncle who later committed suicide. Ross would later become known as the roadside strangler because in some cases he just strangled them right there on the roadside and left. During his interview, he recalled one of his murders with laughter and excitement as he gave details of how easy it was for him. According to him, he was driving when he saw a lady by the roadside, and without the lady saying a word to him, he stopped his car, got out, went over to her, and just strangled her right there on the road. So as he talked about his victims, people could see he was a deranged psychopath. Ross confessed to enjoying himself during his acts, boasting his insane strength that he had as he strangled them. Perhaps even more terrifying was the fact that this guy really wanted to get out there and do some more.
I'm not a big serial killer, by the way. Eight people, that's nothing. I mean, there's a lot of other guys you can go see.
May 13th, 2005, Michael Ross was executed by lethal injection at Osborne Correctional Institution, Connecticut.
Here you can see drastic change during the trial. He tries to look as insane as possible.
September 13th, 1984. Andre Chikatilo was arrested as a suspect in a murder case, only to later be released. But this was the beginning of a long list of murders. This guy was a Ukrainian-born Soviet serial killer. He was also a teacher in many schools, where he preyed on students and molested several girls, without suffering any consequences. This guy got away scot-free because his fellow teachers and school management covered up his crimes. They would also have him resign from the school without reporting it to the authorities. On September 13, 1984, he was arrested by 2 detectives for unlawful acts against women in public places. However, he was later investigated as a suspect in the murder of a boy named Dmitry Ptashnikov. However, he was ruled out when a blood sample test came out negative. But this wasn't the end for the Red Ripper. He was eventually found guilty of theft of property from his previous employer. Then he was sentenced to 1 year in prison, but was later released after serving 3 months. Investigators later learned that Chikatilo's behavior was influenced by a traumatic childhood, marked by famine and tales of cannibalism. At least, those were the excuses he gave during his interviews. Chikatilo, known as the Red Ripper, is one of the most cold-hearted killers in recorded history. The methods he used were gruesome, as he would slash, stab, and strangle his helpless victims. In fact, he didn't even have a knife with him. This guy would use his teeth and rip the flesh right off. According to Andrzej, he was told by his mother that his older brother had been kidnapped and eaten by his neighbors, a narrative that haunted him and probably played a role in his cannibalistic tendencies. On February 14, 1994, a firing squad lined up ready to execute this guy for killing 53 women, which he raped and murdered between 1978 and 1990.